Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's special pre-Pesach presentation. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And I believe we have a viewer this evening in Costa Rica. So first for us to have somebody watching in Costa Rica, and Neil Cohen, welcome to you. Our series, I should say, of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Dr. Jon Greenberg. I will introduce Jon to you in just a moment. Please do ask questions. You do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As ever, we will do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility on your screen, and this will allow you, if you wish, to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar. Finally, we are going to record this event and it will be available on our website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. There you will find recordings of other past events as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest. Dr. Jon Greenberg received a bachelor's degree with honours in biology from Brown University and a master's and a doctorate in agronomy from Cornell University. He has also studied at Israel's Yeshivat HaMivtah with its founder, Rabbi Chaim Brovender. In addition, Jon has conducted research into corn, alfalfa and soybeans at Cornell, the US Department of Agriculture and the Institute for Cancer Research at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2021, Dr. Greenberg published this book, Fruits of Freedom, a Passover Hagadah with a commentary from the perspective of the history of food and agriculture, some of which he's going to share with us this evening. So it gives me great pleasure to offer a warm Milim welcome to Dr. Jon Greenberg. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Alan. It's nice to be here with everybody on Milim. I'm very excited to be speaking to our British audience for the first time. Today we'll be speaking about my Haggadah, Fruits of Freedom. But before we get into that, I should first explain exactly who I am and what it is that I do that led to this. As Alan mentioned, my background academically was in agronomy. And when I was in graduate school studying agronomy, I was also beginning to really get serious about my Torah learning at the same time and realized to my surprise there were many parallels between the two. And in fact, many points that I felt could not really be understood in Torah without a little background in natural history or food and agriculture. So this grew into my program, Torah Flora, through which I speak and write about this topic. You'll find some of this material on my website, torahflora.org. And in the Haggadah as well that we'll be looking at today. So part of the agenda that I have through this program is to convince people that people who trust science, that they should not see Torah as an adversary, and likewise those who love Torah should not see science as an adversary, but in fact the two can enrich and enhance one another through honest intellectual inquiry, but it takes some digging, creativity, and it can be done. So you'll be seeing today some examples of where I've attempted to do that. So let's take a look first at the Haggadah, just briefly as a book, and then we'll dive into some of the subject matter in the book as well. So let's first go to, we want to share this PowerPoint. Okay. Here is the cover of the book, and you'll see at the bottom as an Egyptian tomb wall painting depicting agricultural scenes from ancient pharaonic Egypt. There's aquaculture, there's viticulture, there are vines there are animal products, plant products, all sorts of things being produced on the right and then carried in the center toward the scene on the left of the pharaoh and the queen who are being served all of these products. So this was, of course, agriculture by Israelite slaves in Egyptian times. And at the top, we see two independent, free Jewish farmers today on their own farms in Israel. So it's from the Egyptian times to the present, from slavery to freedom. Now, this is an interdisciplinary project. So you'll see on the back cover, this is probably too small to read, but I'll tell you these are blurbs from various people who read it in advance before publication. And what I wanted to point out about this is the diversity of their background. So I have here commendations from rabbis, from archaeologists, from food historians, from a Christian minister, Joan Nathan, author of many Jewish cookbooks, Joan Gardner, who's a gardening writer. It's fairly diverse, and that was the intent here, to bring all of these different disciplines together. Now here's an example of the bottom of a page and how this approach is expressed in the layout of the book itself. So here you see the bottom half of a page from the Haggadah with extensive footnotes at the bottom. So the intent was to provide the full Haggadah with a commentary on the Haggadah that you see part of at the top here in the large print, that is accessible to anyone. So I made sure that this was readable and understandable by people who have a basic familiarity with the Seder, but may not have a really thorough or rigorous background in Jewish scholarship. The footnotes are for those who wish to go further. So you'll see there several footnotes with references to Talmud, to one of the Geonim. You'll see a reference to Virgil, and classic Roman poetry, some scientific papers. There's a Shakespeare reference there, the second from the bottom, and a scientific paper at the bottom. So very diverse, and drawing on all of these with the intention that emet is emet, truth is truth, and so we can delve into all these different areas and be enlightened by all of them. Okay. Another feature that I incorporated, and this became clear as the research proceeded for the book, was that many of our Seder practices have meanings that have changed historically over the years. They've accumulated additional meanings, and in some cases, the original meanings have been forgotten. So the practice itself is preserved, although how we understand why we're doing it has varied. So I incorporated a feature here called "What Does It Mean?" At the end of a section of the Haggadah, you'll see these with a green background. This example here was about karpas. At the top, you see a photo of a cross-section of a banana plant, showing that it in fact is not a tree. You can see the leaves coming up the center of that whirl of leaves there, and banana is therefore pri hadama, not pri ha'etz, and there is a whole story I hope we'll get to today about the use of banana as karpas at the Seder. So the "What Does It Mean" feature sort of summarizes the variety of understandings that karpas has accumulated over the years. Okay, so that's the book. In the back, you'll find multiple, we'll get to this in a minute. In the back, you'll find an appendix with recipes for some of the many versions of charoset and academic references for those who want to pursue them, and a recipe for eingemacht, which is a classic medieval beet marmalade that is sometimes served on Pesach as a sweet. So I want to look now with you at what's actually in this book. So let's start with the nature of chametz and matzah. So the tack that I took here was to build on the research of an archaeologist at the University of Pennsylvania who was also an analytical chemist named Patrick McGovern. He has published several books putting forth and documenting with, to my mind, very convincing evidence, the thesis that civilization began primarily as a way to get a beer. Some people still think that that's its primary benefit. That's debatable, but the argument goes like this, that in very early times, before agriculture and before food storage, people would wander around and pull off the waist-high seeds of tall grasses and eat them. And then, of course, they learned later, once fire was mastered, that you could cook this and make a sort of gruel or porridge. And that was rich in nutrients, as carbohydrates and protein and so on. And then, of course, you had the leftovers. Now, what do you do with that? Well, of course, there was no refrigeration. We're talking in the early Stone Age here. So these were left around. And if the gruel was very thick and doughy, they discovered you could put it back in the fire and it became the first bread dough. And this is how they discovered bread. Well, what happened was that spores of yeast floating on dust particles in the air or present on the grain to begin with would get into this cold leftover porridge and ferment it, and it had the action of raising it just as it does in bread dough. If it was very thin and watery, the same thing would happen. The yeast would get into it and begin to ferment, and this became beer, and they enjoyed that very much as well. So people began to travel farther and farther afield from their encampments to collect more and more grain. to have more bread and beer. Eventually, they discovered that you could store the grain. And of course, it was inevitable that in storage from time to time, some of the seeds would sprout. And they realized you had a little plant, you could put that in the ground, you could grow the grain wherever you wanted. And this was the beginning of village life. People stopped wandering around to collect the seeds and instead could stay in one place and have farms where they would raise grain and produce beer and bread to their contentment. Now, how was the beer produced? So we have some evidence of how this was done in ancient times and is still done more or less the same way in some parts of the world. So let me show you how this is done. I'm not sure why I have a red. Someone sending a question. Well, I'm going to hold off on the questions for the moment, I think, and we'll answer them at the end. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. Okay. So let's take a look at what ancient beer brewing looked like. Okay. So here we have, this is about 6,000 years old. You can see two people drinking through straws from a very large pottery container in Mesopotamia. This is how it was done, and is still done in Western China and a few in villages and a few other places. So what is going on here? The grain is cooked in water, left in this very large ceramic pot. You can see how it is how large it is compared to the people in the picture, and it ferments there, and the beer is formed and consumed right on the spot. Now the chaff from all this grain will float to the top, and so it's difficult to pour off a clean cup of it. So instead, it's drunk through straws, not a plastic straw, but literally a straw, a hollow grass stem. And the whole village gathers around and drinks together like this. One consequence of this, of course, is you cannot poison just one person. So there's an element of trust here. And some have suggested that the custom of toasting, where we reunite all the glasses, may be a vestige of an earlier time where this was done to express trust among the people drinking together that no one is poisoning everyone else's drink. There's no way to verify that, but it's an interesting idea. Now, who did this? Well, that pot, of course, is open and very heavy and fragile and therefore not portable. So this beer was made, and continues to be made and drunk by villagers, people who are farmers and live in a village in one place. However, the Israelites, in our earliest years, in the patriarchal period of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were not farmers. They were primarily pastoral nomads. They had flocks of sheep and cattle and goats, and they would wander around because the vegetation is sparse because of the dry climate in the Middle East, so you have to keep moving around. And as a consequence, beer was not portable and was not as popular. So we find that among Israelites, the primary alcoholic beverage is wine, because wine can be stored in these amphorae you see here on the back of a camel and carried with you. And to this day, alcohol is nearly synonymous with wine in a Jewish context. Kiddush, Havdalah, baby naming, circumcision, all of these contexts, the 4 cups at the Seder, it's always wine. And in some situations, beer is permissible as a substitute, but wine is preferred and wine is our primary alcohol. So what you had was a kind of a culture conflict between farmers who lived in one place and farmed and produced beer, and nomadic shepherds such as Israelites, and we could also add to this the Hittites, and in Greece also wine was considered superior. The northern Mediterranean, and rather than the southern Mediterranean in Mesopotamia, where beer was more popular. So there was a little bit of a culture conflict there, and in Mesopotamia and Egypt, because we'll get to that in a moment, because the process of fermentation was not understood, but was essential for producing an important product in the economy and in the diet there. It became part of the religion. So we have beer gods and goddesses in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. Here, for example, is Hathor, the Egyptian beer goddess. You'll see here in the earliest depictions, such as in the lower right, she's depicted as a cow. She is here nursing Osiris, who is hiding in the reeds at the edge of the river from other gods who wanted to kill him. And she took care of him as he was a child and eventually married him when he grew up. The red disc between the horns there, it represents the sun because she is the daughter of Ra, the sun god. You see at the top right, a later, more human depiction, again with the sun disk and the horns more formalized as a headdress rather than physical horns on her. And finally, to the left, a later depiction, very human, with this sort of 1960s bouffant hairstyle, but still the cow-like ears as a vestige of her early work. So she is associated with beer drinking and with all sorts of pleasurable activities in Egyptian mythology. Okay, now what happens when Israelites and Egyptians come into contact? So we know that there was a time during the Bronze Age when Egypt was a commercial power, but not yet a military power. It was an open society. People came from all over to trade. And people from Canaan, Israelites and Canaanites and Hittites would come down to Egypt to trade. They were known as Hyksos. That's a corruption of an Egyptian name meaning foreign princes. And we know what they looked like. And this is very interesting for a reason that will probably many of you will see right away when I show you the picture. We have a depiction of Hyksos in an ancient Egyptian wall painting coming down to Egypt to trade. That's funny. Oh, did I leave it out here? I'm sorry. I guess I did. Okay, but I will tell you that they're depicted in unusual dress for the time. The men are wearing brightly colored clothing. Mostly in the ancient times in the Middle East, men wore plain white clothing. Women sometimes wore very colorful clothing and jewelry and other adornments. But this was noticeable to them. This is what they would wear when they came to Egypt to trade. We know that one Israelite lost his on the way there, right? And came into the country instead as a slave, and was imprisoned with two people. Who were they? They were the wine steward and the brewer, who was also the baker. They would make a kind of a hard, dry bread, sort of like a dog biscuit. It was used not for eating, but for crumbling up in water and fermenting to make the beer. So the brewer was also the baker. So apparently what happened was these Hyksos were in contact with Egyptians who were primarily beer drinkers, though they did have wine. And eventually they set up their own capital and took over the northern part of Egypt near the Delta and set up a Hyksos pharaoh as a ruler. And the loyal Egyptians were pushed to the south. Eventually they came back up to the north and drove these people out. So the Hyksos rulers had an interesting dilemma. How do we civilize, in our view, these Egyptians? Because they're beer drinkers and they're not civilized wine drinkers like us. So what do? We could adopt some of their customs so they'll accept us as rulers, and we could drink beer like them, or we could try to show them the superiority of a wine culture over a beer culture, and get them to drink wine like us. So the debate was going on apparently in the palace, and the pharaoh got fed up with the arguing and threw the two chief advocates in prison, decided to make up his own mind. There's Joseph, all of a sudden, in with his two cellmates, the two sides of this culture war going on. So we know the outcome, right? What happened? The wine steward was restored to his office, and the baker and brewer was executed. So apparently wine carried the day. Now, when Joseph's family eventually arrived, they were in good with the pharaoh. These were fellow Hyksos, and they were given a privileged position, and everything was fine for them. Unfortunately, when the native Egyptians revolted later and overthrew the Hyksos pharaoh, with a vengeance. We have records of their furious onslaught against the Hyksos. All foreigners were either kicked out of the country, killed, or enslaved. And all of a sudden, we had been a colonial elite, and now we were on the outs with the new native Egyptian pharaoh. So I'm sorry, someone is very urgently trying to reach me, and I am not going to speak to them right now. Okay, sorry, I don't know what that was. Okay, so we had this sort of culture war about beer and wine. Beer was, of course, kosher, but it was what we would call abyssal goyish. It was culturally not Jewish, whereas wine was very Jewish. So what happens is we see that as this contest develops between the single invisible God of the Israelites and the Pharaoh, and it escalates into, of course, the plagues and eventually the Exodus, that we see one of the Torah's great agendas here, which is to undermine and discredit polytheism and animism. beliefs that there are more gods or that inanimate objects have some power over us and things like that. So what happens? So if we look at the Egyptian mythology, we find there's one story that is very, very popular there, just as today, even in families that have no particular religious loyalty at all, it's very common for children to be given a Noah's Ark toy and to learn the story and to play with the animals. And this story apparently had the same status because we find many copies of it in the Egyptian tombs. It's called The Destruction of Humanity. So what happens in this story? Hathor, the beer goddess who I showed you a few minutes ago, is sent by her father Ra, the sun god, to put the fear of him into humanity because they're not showing him adequate respect. So she goes on a killing spree and begins to kill people right and left all over. And at a certain point, Ra is afraid that there will soon be no humans left at all to worship him. So what does he do to subdue her? She's in this sort of wild feeding frenzy. So in Egyptian religion, beer colored red with pomegranate juice was used for sacramental purposes. And so what he begins to do is pour this all over the earth, and she sees it, mistakes it for blood, and consumes it, becomes drunk, and passes out. So humanity is preserved. Now, that's the story. What's fascinating about this is if we look at the story of the Exodus, and particularly the 10 plagues, we see that every element of that story is inverted. It's entirely discredited. Ra is the sun god. He's the ruler of the gods. Okay, we're going to have a plague of darkness. No sun. All right. The red beer, the pomegranate colored sacramental beer is sacred. The river Nile, which is the source of water, becomes red, but it's not sacred. It's undrinkable, right? Everything is inverted. What was praiseworthy is terrible, and vice versa now. All of the animals that were supposed to be worshiping Ra now come out of the water and attack the people. We have the Tzfardea, which may be the frog, it may be a crocodile. We have the wild animals attacking people. We have the lice. Everything in the story has been inverted. So this is part of what's going on there. If we look at the Egyptian mythology and the natural history of what's happening, we can see very clearly that this is what's going on there. Okay, so that's one story that's outlined in depth in the Haggadah. And we have pictures of Hathor and of the very hail damage to crops from a hailstorm and what that looks like and so on. Another story I encountered while putting this together, while doing the research for the Haggadah that I found fascinating, is concerning a practice called Mayim Shalanu. So the basis of this, let me just mention first that I know some of you may have been lucky to be present where matzah is being made. You may have noticed, if you had a chance to see this, that it's required everywhere for certified kosher for Pesach matzah to be made. The water that's to be mixed with the flour to make the matzah must be drawn the day before it's to be used and stored in a container. Okay, why is this done? So this goes back to a statement in the Talmud and a little bit of comedy here, actually. Let's take a look at what happens here. Let's see. We want to. Oh, what happened to share? Oh, here it is. Okay. Let's take a look at. Here we are. Okay. So here's the statement at the top here from Masechet Pesachim of the Babylonian Talmud, saying that matzah dough should be made only with water that's been stored overnight. Now, it's interesting. He actually says a woman should not do this. Now, traditionally, of course, most bread making in that time was done by women, although the Talmud also says that for matzah making, a husband and wife should make the matzah together. Why? Because this is how things are done by the poorest people, and this is lechem oni, the bread of poverty, and you should mimic the bread making practice of a poor person, ideally, which is the husband and wife do this together. There's no division of labor because they can't afford that. Okay, so how is it to be done? With Mayim Shelano, he announced. This is Rabbi Yehuda's statement. It was taught in Papunia. So Papunia was apparently a sort of a remote area that was difficult to get to. It was remote from the yeshivas, and so it was a chance to go out and do some public education before Pesach. You have to use Mayim Shelano to make your matzah. So Shelano, that means ours, right? Mayim Shelano, our water. Okay, we had maybe from a Jewish-owned well or some special water that the rabbis have. So the next day he woke up and everyone's at his door with a pitcher. Give us the water to make the matzah. He said, no, not Mayim Shel Anu, our water, mayim shelanu, water that has rested overnight, meaning you have to take the water the day before. This is the entire discussion of this subject. There is no explanation given for why this is necessary to do. Some of the commentators, Rashi here, for example, says it has to do with making sure that the water is cool so that it will inhibit any fermentation in the batter when it's put together. Okay, it's certainly possible. Now, if we go further on in the same Masechta, the same volume of the Talmud, from 42 up to page 94, we see a very different story here. An argument about astronomy. The sages of Israel say the sun during the day travels below the firmament. So this is the Babylonian view that the sky is a big solid blue bowl, and during the day the sun enters at the eastern side under the bowl, traverses the inside of it, and then at night slips out under the western edge and travels back on the outside at night to repeat the process the next day. Sages of the nation say, and here we have the Ptolemaic or Greek view, during the day the sun travels below the firmament and at night below the earth, so it makes a complete circle around the earth, right? So at night the sun is under the earth. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said, oh, that makes more sense. Notice they're not talking about Torah here. He has no compunction about adopting the Greek view rather than the Babylonian view that had been common among the Jews at that time, because it made more sense. Why? If you go out to a pond early in the morning, you'll see a mist over it. It must be, he thought, because the sun is under the earth, heating the water from below, and it's steaming. Now, naturally, we react to this and say, well, of course, this is not true. And it's perfectly obvious that it's not true, because if you touch that water, you see that it's cold and not hot. Okay, so therefore, you see Rabbi Natan tries to add to this, the rainy season being the cooler season, the sun travels low in the sky, and therefore the world is cold. Okay, now, this is a totally separate topic from what we just learned about Mayim Shalano. However, Rashi, apparently, as far as I can tell, is the first person to put these two statements together. Aha, he says, the reason we have to use Mayim Shalano to make matzah is that the sun is warming the springs from below at night, and if we take it early in the morning, it will be warm and therefore more likely to ferment. But if we take the water the day before and let it stay in the house in a container overnight, then it will be cooler, and we can be assured that our matzah dough won't ferment. Okay. So this is halacha l'masa. This is practical halacha nowadays. Anyone who makes matzah and wants to get a kosher certification for it for Passover must take the water the day before. No one believes anymore that this is the reason, of course. So the question is, why has it persisted? Now, it's interesting, the original section that we saw that told us to do this did not give a reason. It did not say that was the reason. Rashi inferred that that was the reason because he accepted the Ptolemaic view of the solar system. After Copernicus, of course, we would question that. So he was a bit of stuck. Now, for the most part, we did, the matzah bakers just do this. Most of the matzah, and I'm talking here about now the hard, crisp Ashkenazic matzah, the machine-made as well as the handmade. Most of it in this part of the world, in the US, and I believe it's the same is true in Britain, is made in the winter, January or February. So certainly if you have a water tank in a commercial matzah bakery that is outdoors and you fill it with water the day before you use it, it will be quite cold the next day. So that's fine. However, around 1960, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, who was the head of the Yerushalayim Old City Beit Din, received a question from Buenos Aires, from a matzah bakery in Argentina. Now that's in the Southern Hemisphere, of course. And so our winter is their summer. So they could also follow the standard practice and store the water in a container outdoors before using it, make matzah the next day. But the result of doing that will not be to make the water colder. It will make it hotter because it's sitting outside in the summer. So they wrote him a letter. What do we do? Should we abandon this practice or should we do something else? So the response was very interesting in terms of handling a new situation and making it consistent with a mitzvah a halacha whose purpose is not entirely clear to us, but was traditionally explained in a way that's no longer tenable, that the sun is warming the water from below. So what he answered them was, this is the halacha and you must take it the day before you use it and store it in a container. However, I see your problem. You could, for instance, use a walk-in refrigerator. You could store the water in a refrigerator, in a refrigerated storage room. You could add ice to it. You could do all sorts of things to ensure that it's cold, but you must take it the day before. Okay, now in the end, he's a little bit of it. He also suggests if this isn't going to work for you, if it's not practical, you could, of course, import matzah from the Northern Hemisphere. Or finally, he reveals his own personal agenda at the end. You could come here to Israel and let us all hope that soon the Mashiach will come and we'll all do our mitzvot as they were intended in the land of Israel. So his subtext there, of course, is get out of that crazy, godforsaken place and come here to Israel. Not recorded that was listened to, but what's interesting is that he was able to preserve the halakha without making it look ridiculous by dealing with the practicality of the situation. So that is certainly an interesting example of one way of reconciling science and Torah when they appear to superficially to conflict. Another thing I came across while I was putting the Haggadah together was an interesting pattern in the history of Jewish food, which I will show you here. And it made the Haggadah unique in an unexpected way, which is what? Which is, it is the only Haggadah that contains chametz. Here is a unique sort of challah called Enei Haman. It's traditionally made by the Jews of Morocco for Purim. It's a very interesting, flavorful challah. You can see there are almonds around the edges, decorative edge, and there are fennel seeds and all sorts of spices in there, and 2 hard-boiled eggs that I dyed red to make them look a little more diabolical, held on with crisscrosses of dough. So this challah with the 2 hard-boiled eggs embedded is brought to the table for the feast of Purim, and then before anyone washes to make motzi, people at the table rip out the eggs and consume them. They represent Haman's eyes. What occurred to me is that this is very closely related to much of what we have at Pesach, which is the charoset, and it's a deep pattern that we see again and again in the history of Jewish food. Anything terrible that happened or almost happened and was averted becomes dessert, right? Think of the charoset, the incredible profusion of different Purim sweets representing different parts of Haman's body. I have found about 15 of them that are listed in the Haggadah, his nails, his eyes, his ears, his foot, even a braided challah to represent a rope for the noose to hang Haman, and even a candy called Haman's fleas. So all of these exist. So apparently everything that we celebrate that didn't happen or that we've recovered from becomes a dessert. So we have the sweet of charoset on Pesach. Someone asked a question about Eingemach. So this is a relic of a time when you couldn't buy kosher for Passover jam and things like that. But people had roots in their root cellars, such as beets, that they kept over the winter. And if that's all that was left, they could cook that with honey and later cane sugar when that became available to make a kind of a beet marmalade with ginger. And that became popular as a Passover treat. Some families still make this. It's a very Ashkenazi thing because of the cold winters in which these root cellars were used. So that seems to be an interesting pattern we see again and again in Jewish history that I thought was kind of entertaining, and it was fun to put a chametz stick challah into the Haggadah, a picture of one. Another interesting story. We still have time. Oh yeah, but this is one of my favorites. This year, because Pesach begins Motzei Shabbat on Saturday night, we have an interesting visitor, which is the Pesach bunny. And this has nothing to do with a Christian holiday that occurs around the same time of year that also involves a bunny. This is actually a hare, not a rabbit. And its story, I'm going to show you its story in pictures here. Part of it may be familiar to some of you, but there's a second part that I discovered while writing the Haggadah that I think was not known before. So in this situation, when Pesach or any major holiday begins on a Saturday night, we have a little bit of a halachic dilemma. Saturday night, of course, we make Havdalah at the end of Shabbat, but it's also time to make Kiddush to begin Yom Tov. So how do we do this? Do we make Havdalah and then Kiddush, or Kiddush and then Havdalah, or do we somehow integrate them? So the Talmud considers several options and decides on a kind of integrated order, combining Havdalah into Kiddush. If you look at the Kiddush at the beginning of the Haggadah, you'll see in parentheses usually options if it's a Saturday night to add these other sections. And what it is essentially is Havdalah integrated into the Kiddush. Now, how do you remember the order of all these steps? So the Talmud gives us an acronym, Yaknahaz. So the Yud at the beginning stands for Yayin, Kuf for Kiddush, Nun for Ner, Hey for Havdalah, the blessing Havdalah, uh, and Zayin for Zman, for Shehechiyanu at the end. So that's the order in which you combine them. How do you remember this Yaknahaz? So we see, if you look at some of the old Haggadot from German-speaking countries, we see some strange pictures. And these pictures also appear on the walls of some old German Sukkot, because Sukkot can also begin Motzei Shabbat. And we have a Yaknahaz there as well for making Kiddush in the Sukkah. So here, for example, is a Haggadah from Germany from the late 1400s. You can see from the texture on the page, this is Borei Pri Hagafen, and the beginning of Kiddush is here. And on that page, we see a scene of a hunter with his dogs pursuing a hare up a hill. And above his head, you can see the words Yain Kiddush Ner Havdalah Zman. That's Yaknahaz. Now, but what does this have to do with hunting? Hunting is, of course, not a Jewish activity. And even if you catch the hare, it's not kosher. So what this stands for is to remember the Yaknahaz, to remember Yain Kiddush Ner Havdalah Zman, is a German phrase, hunt the hare, Jag dem Hass, which sounds like Yaknahaz. So it's a mnemonic to a mnemonic. And this is fairly common in the old German Haggadot. Here's one in Augsburg, 1534. It's not quite as legible. This is a woodcut rather than a hand-painted one that we just saw. You can see the hunter on the right blowing his horn to summon the dogs who are in the center, chasing the hares into a net that looks like a soccer goal, or a football goal, as you would call it in Britain. And this is how hares were hunted at that time. Now, what's interesting is that in a later edition, a second picture was added. Here you see the hares have slipped under the net, and they're looking back over their shoulders at the dogs about to get caught in the net. There were no captions to these pictures. What does this remind you of? When the Jews were doomed, but we escaped, and instead our pursuers or enemies met the fate they had for us. It's the crossing of the Red Sea, of course, right? They thought we were going to drown in the Red Sea, and instead they did. And there were no captions. These books were subject to censorship. And these little cartoons embodied an idea, a wish for freedom from anti-Semitism and oppression that Jews widely experienced in the 16th century in that part of the world. But you couldn't say it out front, so you couldn't say it publicly, so there was no caption. But as they say, Hamevin Yevin, those who understand will understand. Okay, well, that's fine. Now, here's the problem then. Here is the Barcelona Haggadah. This is a hand-illuminated, beautiful Haggadah from the 14th century from Spain. So German puns are not going to explain what happened here, and it's a little bit different. So on the left, you see the page Avadim Hayinu from the Maggid, telling the story of the Exodus, and you can see the Jewish slaves carrying heavy weights up a ladder as they're building a stone tower. And on the right, we see the taskmasters on horseback yelling at them and supervising them. But on the top of the page, above the frame around that picture, you see the hare, this time not being pursued by a hunter, but sitting on a golden throne and being served wine in a golden goblet from a golden bottle by an obsequious bowing dog, while the hare sits on the throne. In other words, the hare, the pursued Jew, has become the king here. There's been a reversal of roles. And the dog, presumably the Egyptian or perhaps the Spanish ruler who was suppressing them, is now in the role of the servant serving him. So the concept of freedom here is not freedom from monarchy altogether, but a reversal of roles, that the ruler becomes the ruled and vice versa. On the page with Kiddush and Havdalah, you see on the right, Borei Merei Ha'esh, part of Havdalah. Here again, the hare in an elegant embroidered cloak with a decorative border is holding a stick that he's using to hit or control a dog, while a very modestly dressed pig with her hair covered and a very long dress is again serving the hare a golden goblet of wine. So again, the hare has become the ruler, and the pursuing dog is now controlled, and the reviled pig is now a servant as well. It's tempting to think, since this is from the time of the Reconquest, well, before the Reconquest, before the Inquisition certainly, that perhaps the dog and the pig represent a Christian and a Muslim, although which is which, it's hard to be sure this is even the intent. But clearly there's a wish here for a reversal of roles. And again, no caption. It's again, Hamevin Yevin, those who understand will understand, and we can slip under the eye of any censor and claim ignorance of any censorship here. But what does this have to do with Yaknahas? That pun only works in German with Jag dem Has. It doesn't work in Spanish. The clue here is that a hare in Spanish is called, conejo is a rabbit, it's not conejo. A hare in Spanish is liebre. What does that sound like? If you know only maybe a dozen words of Spanish like me, you immediately think libre, right? So the hare now is a liebre libre, a free hare. And so the name itself becomes a pun on the wish for freedom here. So again, these are examples of things that could easily pass below the radar and not be understood without a little explanation. I'll tell one more story and then we'll go to questions, I think. This one is kind of a fun one. People often ask me, because I'm doing agricultural things, to talk about Jewish environmentalism. That's a subject for another time. The Haggadah is not primarily environmentalist. It is more using science and history in the service of Talmud Torah. But there is one environmentalist piece in there, because the subject matter called for, and I thought it was very interesting. So let's take a look at what the Mediterranean looked like at the end of the last ice age, and we'll see a dilemma that our ancestors had in Mishnaic times and what they did about it. And here we can take a little an inspiration from a historical and religious background here. So let's take a look at, we have some pictures here. Let's go to here. Okay. So after this story, okay, now on the left, you see a typical Mediterranean landscape. This is an aerial photograph of one of the Greek islands. You can see the tops of the mountains are bare stone. The soil has completely eroded away, and sparse vegetation even below that. At the end of the last ice age, the entire Mediterranean basin was forested, and it looked like the picture on the right. The only remnant left of this forest is in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. The rest of it has been removed. What happened was that as agriculture began, people began to plant and plow on steep hillsides. And the result was there was no longer an extensive network of roots from grass and trees to hold the soil in place, and it washed away. And as a result, we get these rocky Mediterranean landscapes with olive trees and things like that that can tolerate this dominating the scene. That's very typical of the region today. But this was not what it looked like 10, 15,000 years ago. Okay, what happened was that overcropping and overgrazing, animals like goats that tear the grass out by the roots when they eat it, denuded the soil of protection, and soil erosion was wild and uncontrolled. So this got to the point that it was really endangering the food supply. We have in the Mishnah, actually, in Mishnah Baba Kama, chapter 7, Mishnah 7, if you want to look at it, a prohibition on raising sheep and goats in populated areas of the land of Israel because they were destroying the area. Now, this raised a lot of interesting questions. We know that there were sacrifices every day in the temple at that time, and we know that at Pesach, every family needed a young sheep or goat for their meal. Where did they come from if you weren't allowed to raise them? Josephus, in his history, writes that at Pesach time, there were so many of these animals imported into Israel that everywhere you looked, the landscape was completely white. It was just packed with these sheep and goats wherever you went. He didn't know where they came from. He doesn't, or if he knew, he doesn't record it. We don't know from him where they came from. Around 15 years ago, the answer to this puzzle began to emerge in archaeological excavations of outside of where the biblical walls, not the present day medieval walls of Old City Jerusalem, were located. There was a garbage heap with lots and lots of sheep and goat bones. So many that the archaeologists were convinced these must be the bones of the Korban Pesach, because there's an enormous number of them. Now, it's possible through isotopic analysis to determine from these bones what kind of environment these animals lived in and what kind of diet they had. And so they did the analysis, and what they determined from the carbon and nitrogen isotopes in the bones, that these animals had been grazing in a dry, arid area in the northern Arabian Peninsula, which means they must have been driven overland from southern Iraq, northern Saudi Arabia today, by people who were hired to walk with them all the way to Israel every year before Pesach. That's an enormous task, and it must have been very expensive. But the alternative was to destroy the agricultural productivity of the land of Israel. So our ancestors were in a dilemma, but they were determined not to give up. They said, we will not give up our religion. We will not give up the Korban Pesach. We will not give up the land of Israel and its productive capacity. We'll do whatever we have to, even if we have to import these animals from very far away at enormous expense. We will have the Korban Pesach. We will have our productive land of milk and honey. So we can take an inspiration from our ancestors about the sacrifices that were necessary to maintain both Jewish practice and a healthy environment. And maybe that can be an inspiration for us today. So this is also written up, and I got these sources there for the scientific publication of the analysis if you want to have a look at that. If you find this sort of thing interesting, which I hope you do, here are some things you can do. First of all, you might want to have a look at my website, or you might want to buy a copy of Fruits of Freedom, my Haggadah. So here's what you can do. Okay, so the website, again, is torahflora.org. If you go to the Haggadah page of torahflora.org, just click on the menu there on Haggadah, you'll see information about the Haggadah and a link to order it if you wish from the publisher, bookbaby.com. You can join my email list, which I do not share with anyone, for announcing my speaking events and publications. I will be speaking live in late May in London, May 20th to 25th. I will be in London at a couple of speaking engagements there, and it'll be published on the website and in my email list. If you'd like to join the email list, you'll get advance notice of that. If you do join the email list and decide to order the Haggadah as well, you get 2 bonuses. First of all, let me know your intention to buy 4 or more of them, and I'll send you a coupon code for a discount on the publisher's website. And because the Haggadah is so full of information and you want to avoid giving a lecture like I just did at your Seder, I can send you a copy of Seder Tips, which is a little document of fun activities to do at the Seder to communicate these concepts without going through a long, detailed lecture. So I encourage you to have a look at those, and you can send me your email address by email, john@torahflora.org. You can put it in the chat, and I'll copy it down from there, or you can contact me through the website. Okay, we have some time for questions, I think, Jonathan. Yes.
Yeah, we do definitely. So please type your questions in the few minutes we've got left, and John will be pleased to answer them. We have a question from Yvonne Cheney in Southern California. She says, regarding the Seder plate, do you mention in your book about the addition of an orange to represent women?
Interesting. I do mention the addition of citrus to the Seder plate, but those who came up, Susie Heschel and others who came up with the idea of adding an orange to the Seder plate for that purpose may be surprised or maybe even disappointed to learn that they were anticipated by many centuries by Tosafot, which says to use an etrog, not an apple, to make your charoset. So actually there has been citrus on the Seder plate in some people's houses for centuries. Rav Soloveitchik advocated for this, and his student, Herschel Schachter, found he couldn't get an etrog at Pesach time, which is no surprise. So he instead is using orange. So the orange is well represented. In more recent years, I understand that story about the origin of the orange in the Seder plate as a feminist statement has been disputed. I'm not convinced that those who are revising the story have much evidence for that. So I mentioned it briefly there, yeah. And there's a whole section about recipes. There are over 70 recipes for charoset, and what's fascinating is that the ingredients represent not only what's available in a certain area, but also different theologies to represent different symbolism of different ingredients, thick versus thin. All of these have theological symbolisms that are discussed in the Talmud, and you're welcome to explore those as well. Questions?
I think you were talking about bananas, weren't you? I don't think you actually
the banana. I didn't
banana
get
story. So that
right.
Good.
I didn't
I know
get
there's a lot of people here asking for your for your Seder tips and sending their email addresses to us. The safest thing is to send your email addresses to Jon. We will attempt to forward them all on, but just in case we don't, please do send directly to him. We'll put his address. So tell us your address again, and we'll put it up in the chat.
Right. Jon with no H, Jon at torahflora.org. TORAHFLORA.org. Yeah, I'll put it into the chat here so everyone can see it. And the banana, that's a wonderful story. So I showed you the picture earlier of the banana plant, and you could see, there's my email in the chat. You can see that it's not a tree. It's really a roll of leaves. So the bracha on a banana is Borei Pri Adama, not Borei Pri Eitz. Now, around 1900 or so, we began to see refrigerated railroad transport bringing tropical fruits up to the north for the first time. And this is when we first begin to see bananas appearing in popular culture and in humor in various ways in northern climates. So there was a Rabbi Preil, succeeded in Elizabeth, New Jersey by his son-in-law, Rabbi Teitz, around 1920, I believe, who popularized using a banana for karpas. The reason was many of his congregants at that time were recent arrivals from Eastern Europe and had never seen bananas before and had no idea what they were, or how to make a blessing on them. So to teach people that the correct blessing on a banana is Borei Pri Adama, he made a point of using it as karpas on a Seder plate. And to this day, people from that area, some of them still have that practice.
And they dip it in salt water?
I wouldn't. I don't know if they do.
It's going to be a bit strange.
Maybe they dip it in chocolate or something. I don't know.
Yeah. It's just an interesting note here from Yvonne about the citrus on the Seder plate. She says she can put an etrog on her Seder plate. She's got etrog trees growing in the garden. That's interesting. Tell us about maror, because most of us here use a horseradish root, which I'm pretty sure didn't grow anywhere near where our ancestors were wrapping their cob on Pesach in soft matzah.
Right. So horseradish originated in Central Asia. And the first recorded reference to it in connection with Pesach is its use as an ingredient, as a spice in charoset, in a medieval German source. What happened was, first of all, let me back up. The Mishnah is very clear that the ideal maror to use is lettuce, and then gives a series of alternatives in descending order of desirability: endive, chicory, and a few that we're not sure what they are. But horseradish is not in there at all. Now, the Gemara elaborates on this with a story that reads as though it was intended specifically to exclude horseradish. The story is that one of the rabbis saw one of his colleagues collecting herbs before Pesach. He said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm trying to collect marir ta for Pesach." Now, the ta ending on an Aramaic word means the. So marir ta would mean the bitter, or the really bitter stuff, the most bitter one I can find. And his colleague replied, "Don't you remember? We learned we're supposed to use lettuce." Why? Because he gives him a midrash to explain. He says, "Kach hayu hamitzrim." The Egyptians were like this. Tchila torach v'sofo mar. In the beginning, it's mild. In the end, it's bitter. So what this refers to is that lettuce plants, if you leave them in the ground past the point of maturity, where they're usually harvested, they will become very bitter slowly, but they will eventually become very bitter. And so too, when we came to Egypt in the time of Joseph, it was great. We were the buddies of the Pharaoh and everything was wonderful. And then slowly the situation deteriorated as the Hyksos lost their power and the native Egyptians went through this ethnic cleansing process and eventually we became enslaved. So what it's telling you is, just as lettuce slowly becomes bitter, so too, this is what we need to be on the alert for. It's not meant to blow your head off. It's meant to warn you of the slow, insidious encroachment of oppression and anti-Semitism. It's to warn you of the oppressor who starts out with telling you you can't go to university and you can't own land, and then you have to live in a ghetto, and then you have to wear an armband, and by the time you realize what's going on, it's too late. That's what maror is about. Now, what happened was, as Jews migrated north and east, especially after the expulsion from Spain, many went to Poland, from there to Russia and eventually the Baltic states, they couldn't get anything green that early in the spring because it was so cold. So at first they began using horseradish leaves, which are at least something green that time of year with a strong flavor. It's not bitter, it's sharp, but that was something they could use. And they went even farther north, they couldn't even get that. They resorted to the root. The Talmud is very clear. It must be the above ground part. It must have the acrid, white, milky sap that you find in dandelions and the base of romaine lettuce when you cut it. It's in the aster family, and horseradish has none of those qualifications. But there was no alternative. What happened was Ashkenazi Jews lived in those places for so long, it became traditional. And by the early 19th century, we have, for example, the Khatam Sofer insisting you have to use horseradish. What is this nonsense about lettuce? The Chazon Ish came to Israel in the early 20th century, attended his first Israeli Seder, and was given a piece of lettuce. And he said, "This is maror, this is garnish. In the old country, we had tears streaming down our faces." The whole point is, that's exactly the misconception. I also grew up with horseradish, that we all developed, that the point of horseradish as maror was to compress 230 years of slavery into 30 seconds. And your face should turn purple and steam should come out your ears. And that's what maror is about. But the Gemara has already pointed out that was the wrong understanding. The point is that it slowly, slowly creeps up. Now, wild lettuce, the ancestor of cultivated lettuce, is a horticultural weed throughout the world now. I found it in New York. I found it in New Mexico. It's in Israel. It's everywhere. And that one, by Pesach time in Israel, is quite bitter. But cultivated lettuce would take a good deal longer. So it's interesting that really it's not the taste itself, the experience that's important here. Even if it's not bitter, it's important that you understand, had I left it in the ground and waited to consume it, it would have gotten bitter. So it's almost a conceptual kind of maror rather than the physical experience. But the lettuce is definitely the preferable one. Nowadays, we don't have the Korban Pesach, so there is no Torah obligation to have maror. It's a custom in remembrance of the Korban Pesach. So we can afford to be lenient for those who insist on using horseradish. But strictly speaking, we should all be using lettuce.
I think many people use both, or have both on their tables. Jon, it's been a real pleasure having you as our guest this evening. You can buy this book through Jon's website. I believe it's also available on Amazon if you want a copy very quickly, and do sign up to Jon's website for those tips and his newsletter. And to say thank you, I'll send you some of my photographs. Hope you'll enjoy looking through those. Now, just a few words about our upcoming program before we leave you. We have a live event on Wednesday, the 16th of April, a welcome return to Jeremy Stowe-Lindner, who is principal of Bialik College, and he'll be our guest to discuss From Talmud to Terror, Jewish Law and the Moral Dilemma of the Hostages. We have much more in the pipeline. Please visit our website at milim.org.uk for more details. All of our online events are free, but you can make a donation to help with our costs. There's a link in the chat. You'll also find it on our website. It remains for me to thank our guest, Dr. Jon Greenberg, once again. Thank you so much, Jon. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
And looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Until next time, stay safe. See you then. Bye.